our first presenter, David Atwood. An amazing title, an amazing piece of work. Prayer in the Abrahamic Traditions, Steering Wheel or Spare Tire. You be the judge. David, we're in your hands.
Thank you. Good morning. Someone once said that the difference between prayer in the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic faiths is that Christians mumble to the ceiling, Jews mumble to the wall, and Muslims mumble to the floor. It sounds like a bit of an oversimplification somehow, doesn't it? But it does beg the question, what is the experience of prayer in these three Abrahamic faith traditions? And how does prayer shape these communities going forward? And in essence, that is what my presentation is about this morning. Churches, mosques, and synagogues today are under pressure in a society which is becoming more and more secularized. Churches are facing closures and amalgamations and continual reductions in membership. Mosques and synagogues have their own unique set of challenges to deal with, such as increasing levels of Islamophobia and anti-Jewish sentiment. The question I would like to explore in my graduate project was how, in such an environment, do these faith communities find a sense of identity and hope? And does that sense of hope have anything to do with prayer? So the study asked the question, how does prayer shape people and their communities, and how does it contribute towards their vitality? Now, when I use the word vitality, I'm not referring to numerical growth. Rather, I'm examining how engaged a community is with its life, its worship, and its outreach to others. And I wanted to explore this question not only from the Christian perspective, but from the context of the three Abrahamic faiths. Because as one person in my focus group said, all faith communities are experiencing pressures and some are under attack, and this is why it's important for faith traditions to come together in dialogue despite their theological differences. The subject of prayer for a graduate project interested me for two reasons. Last year, during my time as a student minister in Bermuda, I was talking to a member of my congregation, and she told me of the sense of hope that prayer once gave to her in the 1960s and the 1970s as a member of a church with a large black community. Now, this is the time in Bermuda when there was a lot of racial injustice, and it was a time when the church practiced segregation as well, where the congregation were expected to sit in particular places in the church based on their race, and where children attended segregated Sunday schools. In fact, I was one of them when I was young. But during that time, she told me there was a prayer group in her church, of which this lady was a member, and she said that what she experienced in that group gave her and the members of her church a real sense of confidence in the future. Now, in time, racial injustice in Bermuda society and its churches ended. But in her view, following this, the emphasis on prayer also declined. She felt that her faith community had lost some of its cohesiveness as a result. And this conversation is what triggered my initial question. How does prayer shape communities and give them a sense of hope? The interfaith aspect of prayer interested me because of an experience I had a number of years ago where I organized a series of discussions on the book of Genesis. I gathered together a small group from the Jewish, Islamic, and Christian communities, and over several weeks we read through the stories from Genesis. We listened to our various different perspectives from these three different faith communities, and I remember that we were all really enriched by the insights that we shared as a group together. So I thought that prayer would also be an area where there are differences and commonalities between the three Abrahamic faiths which would be beneficial to explore, particularly in the context that prayer plays in the life of these faith communities. My project was a grounded theory study, and grounded theory develops a hypothesis by collecting and coding data based on personal insights. The conclusions derived from this type of study came from what emerges from the data. So according to Merriam, any theory that is developed is thus grounded in the actions, the interactions, and the social processes of people. In the context of prayer, I believe it provides a focus on what works in prayer in faith communities. It derives its conclusions from the experiences and the insights of the study participants. To collect the data for my study, I held 2 focus groups and 2 interviews across the 3 Abrahamic faith communities. The Christian group were members from a Wesleyan Methodist church in the Halifax region. And the Islamic participants were associated with the Islamic Education Center, and I also interviewed 2 members from the local Jewish community. So what is prayer exactly? Well, Spilka and Ladd propose that it is a core part of all religious experience, that it exists in the lived moments of religious awareness. Lewis also states that through prayer, an enlivened awareness of God is induced and maintained, and that prayer is a central phenomenon of all religious life. It is a commitment and a practice that forms a basis for religious experience, and that is across all faith traditions. Spilka and Ladd also note that prayer is a social process which is grounded in relationships. Prayer is thus never engaged in alone, but it maintains a sense of connectivity with the self, with others, and with God. Now, Ladd and Spilka highlight an interesting concept about prayer called directionality. And directionality sees prayers as inward, outward, and upward. The directionality of prayer conveys a sense of connectivity. The concept is derived from theological and psychological principles. Thus, inward-oriented prayers involve a search to better know oneself. Outward prayers unite the self with the experience of others. And upward prayers focus on the relationship between the individual and the divine. There are obviously key differences in language and practice across all religious traditions, but arguably all prayer can be viewed and understood through this lens of directionality. So it can be used as a helpful way of examining and understanding prayer across the 3 Abrahamic faith traditions. Now, I was fortunate enough to be able to observe prayer at the Islamic Education Center. And it was evident to me that through what I observed, that those gathered with the imam, they faced towards the mihrab, which is a niche which is placed in the direction of Mecca. The prayers were directed by the imam through the words of the Quran to Allah. It emphasizes upward movement of communication with God, but also every person participating stood shoulder to shoulder and prostrated in unison. Thus the upward movement to prayer to Allah, and it was also an outward act of community. And then after the main prayers were over, each person spent time individually in prayer, and I noticed that then they were facing different directions as they prayed for their own personal needs. So I believe that we would see the same concept of directionality present in Christianity and the Jewish faith traditions as well. Now, for my study, I used 5 simple questions which drew out key insights on prayer and facilitated discussion and the exchange of ideas and experiences within the focus groups and within the interviews. And these were: how did your commitment to prayer, your commitment to the practice of prayer begin? What is it that sustains your practice of prayer? What is it that you experience in prayer? How has prayer shaped your life as an individual, and how has it shaped your life as a community? And from those questions, a number of themes emerged. Some of these were common across all faith traditions, and some were more unique to a particular community. So I described the themes as the call to prayer, metanoia or transformation, shoulder to shoulder in community, the rhythm of prayer, prayer as memory, prayer in the body, and prayer and the world. The theme, the call to prayer, The theme, the call to prayer, emerged from my first focus group question. What instilled in you the habit of prayer? And childhood memory played a very important role here. Most of the participants had been part of a faith community as children. Some of them at one time or another may have drifted away from that community. But these early childhood memories were a persistent voice calling them back and reaffirming a life of faith. And sometimes it was the memory of a parent or a grandparent, or sometimes it was the memory of the sights and sounds from their childhood faith community. A person from the Islamic community said, "For me, it was growing up as a small child and hearing the call to prayer from the mosque. I remember that it had a very soothing effect on me. I remember washing my hands and washing my face in preparation for prayer and bowing to God." He said, "The mosque was central to our neighborhood. It stood right behind my friend's house, and we would often go there and visit as children." A member of the Jewish community said, "My prayer life began with my parents singing me the Shema from Deuteronomy 6 at nighttime. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." He said, "This likely began when I was born. I just got used to hearing them singing that verse over and over again." And a member of the Wesleyan community remembered his grandmother and his mother, who were both what he called strong prayer warriors, who taught him to pray and took him to church and Sunday school. And another said, "My mother used to get us to say our prayers together before we went to sleep. I remember we would pray for all of our relatives." Now, what emerges for me here is the question, to what extent do faith communities, as well as families, self-identify as centers of prayer? In the case of Islam, the minaret on a mosque is a visible, active call to prayer. I suppose much like a church steeple. But sometimes symbols and steeples can lose their meaning in a community. Not all faith communities strongly associate themselves as communities of prayer. And if they don't identify themselves as such, then to what extent are those communities shaped by prayer? With churches facing amalgamations, downsizing, reduced ministry hours, what is it that shapes the decisions of those communities about their future, if it isn't prayer? Metanoia, or transformation, also played an important part in engendering a commitment towards prayer. This theme came up a number of times in the focus groups, particularly in the Wesleyan group, but also in the Islamic group as well. Someone from that group said, "If you have not been brought up in a religious environment, then your life itself creates the lens through which you see the world." He said, "I was rebellious against religion, and I was blaming God for my circumstances, but I came to the point where I was brought to my knees." A member of the Wesleyan community said, "We all come to God through different experiences. I came to Christ through some pretty nasty stuff." And another spoke about the tug towards a completely different direction in life. And one person noted, "I only went to church at Christmas and at Easter, and prayer didn't mean anything before I decided to walk the walk and make a decision. He said I was having a tough time in my life with my job, with my family, and then I remembered the verse from Philippians, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He said I used to repeat it over and over again, and that became my mantra, and my prayer life developed from there. So the experience of transformation lends itself to a commitment towards the practice of prayer. And the question that arises for me here is, to what extent do we see people's lives being transformed in our faith communities? I've attended a number of 12-step groups in the past, and I believe I've seen more evidence of lives being transformed there than I've often seen in the faith communities I've been associated with. I think it's an important question to consider, because don't these individual experiences of transformation lend themselves in shaping the communities of which those people belong? Now, one of the aspects of Islamic prayer which I noticed was that in the mosque, members of the community stood literally shoulder to shoulder. Their shoulders are touching the person of the shoulder of the person standing next to them. And it conveys this very strong sense of community and solidarity. As one of the participants told me, shoulder to shoulder we get to know others. It's a physical act. Sisters are touching sisters. Brothers are touching brothers. The very act of touching each other forms resilience. And the idea is that we can come together. It's a physical coming together, and it's a spiritual coming together. I was reminded of this concept only just this last Sunday at the end of the 9:30 small group worship at Cole Harbour Woodside. And they have this tradition at Cole Harbour Woodside of closing that service by standing in a circle and crossing their arms together and singing the final hymn, God be with you till we meet again. And it's always my favorite part of the worship of the two services for that day. And I really like your sermons, Michael, but that bit is the bit that always gets me. But it's just like the Muslim participant in the focus group described. It's a spiritual and it's a physical coming together. In the Wesleyan community, I saw the very same shoulder-to-shoulder concept. Maintaining a common concern for each other, it was evident in the way that they use their social media. As one of them said, every morning on a rotation basis, we post the name of someone in our church community we are praying for on our internal Facebook page. And if your name is posted, you see within minutes that there are 50 people praying for you. There is an assurance there that people you haven't seen this morning, but you know that they're holding you up in prayer. And I think the same idea is evident in the Jewish tradition, where following the synagogue service, there is Kiddush. It is a coming together for a celebratory meal or a blessing to sanctify Shabbat. I was told by a member of the Islamic community of what happens when you place several grandfather clocks together in a room. Over a period of time, the ticking and the movements of the clocks become synchronized. It's called harmonic induction. And the theme is so evident in the Islamic tradition that for me it speaks volumes in terms of how this concept of common concern can shape a faith community. But also how different this is from the prevailing culture in our society, which tends to focus more on the individual. This idea of harmonic induction, standing together in physical, emotional, and spiritual unity, is a powerful concept. As a member of the Islamic group, folk reminded me it is reflected in the writing of Zephaniah, I will purify the lips of the peoples, that all of them may call upon the name of the Lord and serve him shoulder to shoulder. Another theme was what I called the rhythm of prayer. And this came from insights which I particularly heard in the Islamic and in the Jewish context. One of the pillars of Islam is praying 5 times daily, and in the Jewish tradition, praying 3 times daily. A person in the Islamic group said the beautiful thing about Islamic prayer is that there are 5 opportunities each day to reconnect with God. And this is a developed discipline, of course, and one who had converted to Islam said that in the early days, he thought his new faith shouldn't be called Islam, it should be called Izhar. But that he got so used to the practice of these 5 daily prayers that if he missed one of them, he just didn't feel right within himself. And another said that the practice is a checkpoint. It can act to prevent us from considering immoral actions, he said. It influences us in our day-to-day life. And he said that I believe that the 5 daily prayers makes Muslims more resilient than some other faith communities. And I would tend to agree with what he suggests. It's as if the shoulder to shoulder in community creates this horizontal spatial unity, but the act of rhythmic, repetitive prayer creates a temporal unity. And of course, we have these traditions in the Christian faith as well. They originate in Judaism, they were later developed into the Liturgy of the Hours, and later than that into the daily office. But what I learned from this practice in Islam and in Judaism is the value of this weaving together of our life in the world and our life in prayer. There is a Hasidic saying, when Tevye walks down the road and sees trees, he thinks of the glory of God when he walks, and the wheels of the cart, as they turn, he is saying prayer. Is there an opportunity in Christian communities to take a page from our Jewish and Islamic brothers and sisters? Can we rediscover the rhythm of prayer? And what might that do to shape our communities? One of the aspects which I noted about prayer in the Jewish tradition was this emphasis on memory. Why do we pray? Ultimately, we are responding to God's actions in the world and in history. And this is evident in the Jewish synagogue service, where there is a big context of memory. Here, parts of the synagogue service are there in place of the temple ritual. The temple no longer exists, of course, but there is this reenactment. And the word for remember in Hebrew is zachor. And zachor emphasizes how important it is for faith communities to remember their history. A Jewish contact noted, being a Jew is not being bogged down in today's context only. It is not just about being a post-Holocaust Jew. No, Zachor means that we stand in the whole of Jewish history. This theme really resonated with me from an interfaith context, because as Jews, Muslims, and Christians, we do stand together in a shared history. It begins with Abraham. And I think it's important that as Christians we affirm that history, especially in the midst of a North American society where there is increasing Islamophobia and where Jewish gravestones are being toppled over. Zachor means that we're not merely 3 separate communities. In Abraham, through history, we are one community. In the Islamic tradition, there's a particular emphasis on the physical position of prayer, and it is very evident in standing, bowing, sitting, and prostrating. And one participant said, we submit ourselves to Allah, not only spiritually, but physically as well. In Islamic prayer, this submission happens through bowing and placing one's forehead on the ground. And as one person told me, it is a very unique position where your head is made to be lower than your heart. And someone else said, when in this position of Islamic prayer, there are 7 joints which are touching the floor. That in this position, your breathing literally changes. And I think this focus on the body in Islamic prayer challenges the mind-body dualism, which is so common in Western culture and in Christianity. Valerie Hoffman notes that the Quran does not speak of a body-spirit dichotomy as the problem behind the evils of human existence. I think it is this body-spirit division which lies at the root of why Christian faith communities sometimes find it difficult to talk about the body, particularly in issues concerning sexuality. there is already a risk that prayer becomes something that is only contained and bounded inside a faith community, disconnected from the world. But all of the people that I spoke to saw a deep connection between prayer and ethical action, between prayer and serving others. I really like the story that the Wesleyans told me of a time that they literally went out into the community. I think they stood outside a supermarket and they were praying for people, individuals who were in need. And this guy came along and he was looking for employment, and so they all gathered around him and they prayed, and within like 2 days he'd found a job. It was miraculous. He'd gone for ages without work. Now they're praying that he'll get Sundays off free so he can come to their church. But as one of them noted, you don't have a prayer life, you have a life of prayer. He said, my prayer life started to flow out more naturally when it was more in response to the needs of the world around me. And as someone in the Islamic group told me, prayer in the mosque is connected to what is happening in the world. There has to be a worldly component to prayer. I may not pray as a Trinitarian, but I can help my Christian brother with the problem of homelessness and with poverty and with crime. And one of my Jewish contacts told me that what we are trying to do is build community through communities of prayer. And with that, there comes certain calls to action. There is always some local, global, or national issues that need attention to the fact that there is a divine will or a divine sense of righteousness, something that shows and points out that the world is not as divine as it should be. He said Kaddish, the sanctification meal at the end of services, is critical for expanding what happens beyond when we are praying. This is when the calls to action really start taking place. Beyond whatever that urge is that happens in prayer, where I am imagining that I'm repairing the world. As I conducted this study, there were some theological issues which I had to work through. And it was also important to be able to tie my findings into some sort of a theological structure. And one of the challenges I had was my own Trinitarian understanding of prayer. Does a belief in the Trinity create a theological barrier between Jews, Christians, and Muslims? From the perspective of the Muslim or the Jew, how can we all pray to the same God when the Christian God includes the human Jesus? There's a theological principle that has been in the church since earliest times, first coined by Prosper of Aquitaine, and is called lex orandi, lex credendi, which means that the law of prayer, lex orandi, and worship, grounds and established the law of belief, lex credendi. Prayer comes before belief because it emphasizes a theology of revelation where we are responding to God's word. This is in contrast to reading our word and our cultural connotation into our understanding of God. And it reminded me of the Islamic prayer of submission. It means that we place our head, lex credendi, the law of belief, below the law of worship, lex orandi, which is the heart. In Christianity, we have our earliest form of prayer addressed to the Father, through the Son, in the Spirit. And while Trinitarian, it emphasizes Jesus' humanity, and it emphasizes his oneness and his presence in the Christian community. The later formula, to the Father and the Son and the Spirit, essentially ensures that the persons in the Trinity are hierarchically equal. But it was crafted in response to Arianism, the Arian heresy, which challenged Jesus' divinity. In other words, suddenly we have the law of belief establishing the law of worship. For me, lex orandi, lex credendi, the law of worship, the law of belief, to a large extent resolves that theological barrier because it emphasizes Jesus' humanity as our high priest and his inseparability from the Christian community. As noted by Wainwright in his book, The Study of Liturgy, it is the redeeming work of Christ that makes present the mystery of the Trinity, which is seen as dynamic and not just as an object of faith. But there is another part to the lex orandi, lex credendi formula, and that is lex agendi. And this is the law of ethical action. This is where we have a living theology which supports a response to liturgy and prayer. And in Christian living, as Irwin notes, the issue here is to allow the prayer to shape and challenge how we look at the world and our corporate and personal lives within it. And it reminded me of what my Jewish contact told me, that in prayer we imagine ourselves repairing the world, but it is in Kiddush, after prayer, where the calls to action take place. And I think we saw an example of lex orandi, lex credendi, lex agendi a few weeks ago when the Unitarian Church, through worship, through belief, went out from their community and formed this protective barrier, standing shoulder to shoulder around the mosque in Halifax, a circle that was soon joined by others in the community. Prayer, belief, action. So these are some of the important themes that came to me as I listened to members of these three faith groups, as well as some further theological reflection. And as to my original question, does prayer work and does it shape communities? Yes, absolutely. One person from the Islamic community said that we never had a budget for this mosque. It was built through prayer. But what about faith communities dealing with challenges such as shrinking membership and the like? Well, I saw evidence that communities that identify as communities of prayer are also communities of hope. My Jewish contact said that though the Jewish population is decreasing in Canada and the US, I believe there are certain acts of kindness and acts of social change for positive steps, and that these come because people have been inspired directly or indirectly by our prayers. And a Wesleyan member told me, we have not been broken up as a church. The doors have not been shut because we believe that God wants us to be a worshiping community. Our community still exists, he said, because we believe that prayer is key to our relationship with God. One way or the other, faith communities will be shaped. In Christian communities, one way or another, there will be amalgamations and downsizing and reductions in ministry hours. But the question is, what shapes the decisions which those communities make about their futures? You see, the final destination may not change. The forces and the influences of our society may mean that those faith communities will one day no longer exist. But it's not really about the destination. It's about the journey there and what shapes that journey. So we need to ask ourselves in our individual faith communities, are we on a journey? Are we on a journey where we are known as a community which is in relationship with God? Are we on a journey where others can see in us our common concern for each other? Are we on a journey where we experience transformation? And are we on a journey where we can see and serve Christ in others in the world? As Christians, we are an Easter people, which means that though our destination may be death, our journey there in Christ is meant to be and can be one of resurrection. Thank you. I'd just like to... Just like to acknowledge the many people that helped me, my consultant. I won't name everyone because then you'll know who I interviewed. But my consultants, the Wesleyan Methodist community that I work with, the Islamic Education Center, and those people I interviewed from the Jewish community. And I'd also like to thank my partner, Margaret, who helped critique my slides and script and gave me a sense of realism about it, which he always does. And just a few works I used to come up with that. Any questions? I'll do my best to answer.
Great. David? Son? Cool. Okay. I'll talk into it. Whoa, very good. That always finds it works that way. Questions, comments, insights? Got a couple over here. We got over here.
I have a couple of questions. One concerns, there was a lot of emphasis by your participants on unity and prayer. And so I guess I'm interested if at any point people talked about conflict and prayer, the relation, how that plays out.
Yeah.
And I don't recall the name of the person who said this, but the directionality of prayer. Anyway, it doesn't matter, but so
I think it was Latin Spilka.
Inward, outward, and upward, as if those are, if I understood you correctly, those were kind of separate movements, separate directions. Although if you read someone like Augustine, in his sense of prayer and turning to God, that to go inward would mean to go outward and upward at the same time. So it has a lot to do with how the self is perceived, not as kind of compartmentally related to neighbor, then compartmentally related to God, and compartmentally related to self, but rather that those three directionalities are always already interwoven and part of prayer and responsiveness to God, at least in aspects of the theological tradition, and I'm thinking specifically now of Augustine. So I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah.
So those two things.
My understanding is that they're all operating at the same time as well. I know I did say with the Islamic group that at one point they broke off and prayed separately, but my understanding is that when we pray individually, we are always praying in community, in effect. So there's the prayer of the individual, the community, and to God. So I do see the three directionalities operating at the same time in many respects. And I think of things like the daily office. The individual might be praying the daily office, but there are people all over the world praying it at the same time. There's one large community doing that. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, what's your perception of the theorist you refer to? Is that perceived by him as, because it has profound implications on how we view the self, how we understand the self. And what's your perception of a person you read? What is he perceiving those things as unified or as kind of compartmentalized?
I saw them as unified.
The theorist you were reading.
It was, I think it was, no, I think it was, I think it was Laden Spilka, actually, one of them. Yeah, I'd have to look that up, I'm afraid, but I believe it was Ladd or Spilka or the two of them. It was a paper I'd read on them, yeah. Yeah, but my understanding that the three operated almost like simultaneously.
Okay,
yeah,
that's the theorist is saying that.
I believe so, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I was just curious.
Yeah.
And then about conflict and
Yes.
there's so much emphasis upon unity and prayer. It unifies us. So what's the role of
That did come up a little bit in the Wesleyan group where people were wrestling with God and arguing with God, and I know that's in the Jewish tradition in particular, but people feeling angry with God, but also feeling that they were comfortable in expressing that anger in prayer. So there was conflict not within the community, not what I picked up in the focus groups, within the community around prayer, but more individuals praying around their own individual needs and sort of feeling angry at God and working. But one of the things they said is it's really about relationship. Whether there's anger in the relationship or peace in the relationship or grace, it's a relationship, and the commitment to the relationship was important.
Thank you for your project. My question has to do in those traditions where men and women pray separately. How does that affect the sense of community? Is there a sense of women's community and men's community? How does that work, and do men and women in those contexts experience community and prayer differently?
Yeah. Yes, good question. That was something I wondered as well when I first went to an Islamic service. And obviously there's a different culture there, but at the same time there's some practical issues because when they prayed, they literally are standing shoulder to shoulder. And so in that culture, a man and a woman standing that close together creates some potential challenges. So although I can't really make a judgment on whether that culture is right or wrong, there were more practical issues associated with it, particularly like with the women praying behind the man. There was actually a practical issue associated with that. Not necessarily do I agree with it, but when they explained it, I thought, okay, I never thought of that before. So, yeah. Does that answer your...
I guess part of my wondering was how do those segregated groups within a community experience I guess is their sense of community in prayer limited to their gender?
No. No, I think it was more... I don't think the sense of community is limited to gender. I think it was just that the men line up together, they're touching each other, and the women are as well, but I don't see that necessarily as two separate communities. I think it's the idea of standing next to each other, touching shoulders, and I think it's just a practical issue within Islam of men and women being together in the same space, which is obviously they have a different view on it than in a more westernized culture. Yeah. Does that, yeah.
Question back here.
Thanks, David, for your seminar here. The question that's come to my mind is what your participants saw as like the purpose of prayer. Because there was one participant who said that the church community prayed with him and then he received employment afterwards. And towards the end of the presentation, you talked about churches closing or amalgamating and a sense that God kind of is with us through these hardships and through even death. So did your participants talk at all about how they saw God being with them through hardship or suffering or things that just didn't work out?
Yes, the community I was talking to, we were having some real challenges. And I think all church communities are having challenges. But it's whether, and they have to make decisions about their future. And what I saw was that and not everyone in their community was fully engaged in prayer. There was like a core group that were almost there on behalf of the whole community, but there was a significant number of them. And their decisions they were taking based on a commitment towards prayer. So you can make decisions, I know this from experience with faith communities before, but you can make a decision as a faith community that's not based on faith and prayer, it's based more on fear. And so they were experiencing difficulties, shrinking numbers, but they said that we're here as a worshiping community, God wants us to be here. So I didn't see a lot of fear. I saw, some realism, but I also saw a lot of hope as well. And that's what I meant. It's not about the destination because churches may have to end anyway, but it's more about the journey there. And is that a life of faith or is it a life of, we don't have the budget, we have to shut the building down, but I grew up here, I was confirmed here, we don't want to amalgamate with another church because of my ties to this one. But is that really a decision that the church is consciously taking through reflection and prayer? I don't think it is always. And I saw in this community some hope, real hope there. And so, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, I guess, whether people thought that if they prayed, that God would automatically answer their prayers in the way that they had asked for, or whether it was more God walking with them.
I think it was both. I think in the Wesleyan tradition there was definitely almost like a heavier emphasis maybe on causality between a prayer and the results, but it wasn't that simple either. Yes, they did go out into the community and they were praying for individuals, and this guy did get a job and they did believe that it was a result of their prayers, yes, but it wasn't quite that simple either.
Thanks so much, David. This may well be outside the scope of the work that you were doing, but picking up on Alida's question and comment around conflict, I'm wondering if there was any part of the conversation that talked about the way prayer might be helpful in working with the conflict that seems to emerge between and among these three Abrahamic traditions, because we're certainly seeing a lot of that where Christian faith is being used to denounce our Jewish brothers and sisters, or leading to more Islamophobia. And so I realized that wasn't necessarily the topic, but because you were working with three different faith traditions, was there any sense that prayer might be a unifying force among the three rather than simply within each individual community?
I would say not specifically prayer, but there was a real sense particularly in the Islamic group, of the importance of coming together as faith communities. One of them said, we're all facing pressures. He said, we're under attack. Well, Islam is under attack in North America at the moment, and he said when that happens, it's important for us to be able to stand together. He didn't mention it in the context of prayer. I think that's very relevant, and I think it would be a good thing to do, but it was more like a coming together. And that's where, when I came up with that theme of history, that we stand in a common history with those other two faiths, I thought that was really important, and I think there does need to be more interfaith dialogue and interfaith prayer as well. But it didn't specifically come up in the study.
David.
Thanks, David. It's a great presentation. Perhaps the other side of the coin, though, of Susan's question is, as you went through this study, although it goes beyond the study itself, nonetheless, it may have changed you. It may not have been shattering, but there was some upside, I would think. You must have had deeper insights into other traditions. And how did that affect you in your prayer life and as a Christian?
The one thing that did sort of really hit me a lot was the rhythm of prayer. It was so heavily emphasized in the Islamic faith, praying 5 times a day. Now, I pray in the morning, and a couple of times I've tried to sort of establish a more rhythmic discipline, and I've failed. But and as I said, in the Christian tradition, you have the daily office. So that was one thing that came to mind, that in my own prayer life, I need to try and reconnect with God, not only when I start off in the morning, because by 10:30 everything can go to hell in a hat basket. I think that the practice of actually reconnecting with God, that's what I got from the Islam and the Jewish tradition. They're reconnecting with God during the day, and it really gave me, and I've been working a little bit more with the daily office to try and rediscover that. I thought that was important. So that hit me. I was quite struck by the body-mind where they pray with the in prostration with their forehead against the ground, it really hit me. You know, what they're really saying there is, my heart is higher than my head. And that's what connected to me the lex orandi, lex credendi. You know, I think in theology sometimes we put our mind ahead of our hearts, and so we allow our theology to be driven by our epistemologies rather than be driven by our worship, and that connected with that Islamic form of prayer. And they actually gave me a prayer rug at the end of our focus group, a beautiful sort of black and silver prayer, and I use it. And not consistently, but and I don't use the same prayers, but they were right about it. It does change. It changes the way when you change your body position in prayer, it changes something about that prayer. So I think they pay attention to things like that, and it's good to learn from that. And I think that's one of the other real benefits of coming together as a faith community, because we can pick up these you know, unique things about these other faiths and say, well, that makes sense, you know.
Any other questions? Question back here.
David, thank you. I'm really interested in the relationship, maybe this is a definition question, I don't know, but the relationship between worship and prayer. Are they the same? Are they different? Is one a part of the other? Is that understanding different depending on which of the traditions you're talking about?
That's a good question. I see them very much the same. In Islam, I think I see it very much the same, but I think there's slightly different contexts. So I see prayer and worship being very much unified, but like for instance, in the Jewish tradition, there's this really strong thing about memory. It's thinking back to what God has done for Israel. But I do see the same very interconnected. I see the two things, worship and prayer, as being very interconnected. I mean, right, even when we sing hymns, aren't we essentially praying maybe in a different form? So I find it hard to separate the two. And obviously worship, you know, well, it can be individual, but we think of it in more corporate terms. But yeah, I find it hard to tease the two apart from each other myself.
Time for one more question. So I don't see a hand up, so I'll ask the last question. So you're a United Church minister, and I love what you said. So I've heard apocryphally said that Jews say, you don't want to be a Jew, it's too difficult to be a Jew, right? And Christians, if we take our baptismal covenant seriously, we should say nobody wants to be a Christian, this is tough work, right? And I love the comment from the Muslim who said, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's not, right?
Yeah.
So given that reality, that prayer is tough, and you've said yourself that it's difficult, but you're, you know, a few short weeks, you're going to be a United Church pastor. So out of this study, what will you take into your work in ministry? Because you said also that prayer is efficacious. How will prayer be more dominant in your role as a United Church pastor?
Yeah. I think prayer has always been important to me, but it's something that I've kind of struggled with as well. I think for me, going into ministry cannot be done without prayer. And the other thing is theology cannot be done without prayer either. I think the danger is, and I do this myself, I get locked into an idea about God and a theological concept, and I don't know it, but I'm stuck there. And I think that's the lex credendi. And I think it's prayer that gets me out of that, because your assumptions, your epistemology ends up getting challenged because in prayer it's God towards you. And so theology has to be driven. I don't think you can do theology without prayer. And I think the problem is sometimes we do, and I think the problem is sometimes I do as well. So that's from a personal aspect. If I was a minister in a church, when I'm a minister in a church, I would encourage as we've been doing in formation, there's quite an emphasis on spiritual practices within United Church formation. In fact, to be perfectly honest, coming from Bermuda, I was a little surprised that it was. But it is there, and that's good, because I think that needs to be emphasized, not only with us as ministers, but in our pastoral charges as well. And we have to lead others, and we have to work with pastoral charges so that when we're making decisions, those decisions are not locked into concepts that sometimes need to be broken down through worship and through prayer.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So 4 quick things before we give them a hand. Okay, so first 4 things. See if I can get them all right. The first one is there are evaluation forms. We really appreciate it if you would do the evaluation forms. And they're all there, they're pencils, and if you could just drop them in the box, that would be outstanding. That's the first thing. The second thing is we're going to go in a second to a half-hour break. So we're going to have a half-hour break. There are refreshments across the way, and it's a beautiful day, so feel free to mill around. But we'll be back here at 10:30 sharp. Second announcement. The third announcement is that when we come back, we're going to explore spirituality and tattoos. Fascinating journey. And this brings me to the fourth and final thing. This morning, in our first presentation, David took us on what I count to be a really incredibly significant journey with 3 traditions. I hope with a spirit of excitement, adventure, and connection. There's something at stake in what we do, and I think, David, you certainly took us there in one of the most pivotal and cradle places that all 3 traditions find themselves, and that is in the place of prayer. At the very center of how we function in all those traditions is prayerfulness. You took us there. I feel wiser for the experience. Thank you.